no energy on carnivore diet. It's not the salt. Well, it could be mitochondrial damage. If you've had a lot of mitochondrial damage for a very long time, you've been on a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet, your mitochondria have been bombarded with a lot of deuterium, because those foods tend to be seed oils and vegetable and plants, especially sugary plants and fructose, tend to be much higher in deuterium. If you get over the threshold of deuterium, where the Krebs cycle, the TCA cycle, the citric cycle, whatever you call it, if that cannot remove that excess deuterium, then what happens is that excess deuterium introduces in the metabolic water within the actual matrix of the mitochondria, will introduce far more neutrons, heavy water. So when you have more neutrons, those neutrons will get pumped through the pumps in the electron chain, and they will end up in the inner mitochondrial membrane and that outer part of the folds. And when that happens, when they try to go through the ATP synthase that produces energy, that rotating complex 5, which rotates at 9,000 RPM. Well, what they can do is, if a few neutrons go through, they'll slow it down. If a lot go through, they will actually bust it. And if you've got a lot of busted stuff, then your body starts shifting towards a more glycolytic, using sugar as energy, more glycolytic pathways, which can predispose you then more to cancer, because the cellular energy production drops and behaves differently. Obviously, when you go on any low carbohydrate diet, your energy levels drop, and in comparison to your previous diet. And that's because of mitochondrial damage. That's something to worry about, and not something to basically ignore. But at the same time, the more animal-based food you will consume. I've done a number of videos on senolytics, how to basically get rid of old damaged cells, and stuff like that, how to get rid of, these sort of, using fasting methods to remove those things and become more insulin sensitive, and also get good sleep. So blue blocking glasses, reduce your blue light exposure at night so you can actually have more melatonin. Melatonin heals the mitochondria. So you need to basically heal those mitochondria, and over time, and be patient. Be patient. Taurine also helps in actually reducing this oxidative stress problem inside the cell, and actually regulates the pressure within the cell, which means that the cell will actually become better functional, and over time should improve. In the early stages, it could be just a certain level of adaptation that you need to shift over to. So it could be that if these are the early stages, because I've never sseen you before SSK, so it could be you're in an early transition, and it's more an adaptation to, you could sort of, if you do a hardcore, 48-hour fast, and you force yourself into a ketotic state, shifting into a fat adapted fat oxidation state, and you see improvements in energy, that means your mitochondria may not be too bad in that regard. But if you don't, that means you may have suffered far more mitochondrial damage. I don't know your past history. I don't know whether you've had heart condition, chemotherapy that can damage mitochondria, a lot of things. So exposure to certain things, chemicals, can actually have a devastating effect on energy production, mitochondria, that are involved in oxidative phosphorylation. That means they use oxygen to basically generate energy through the electron chain to produce ATP. Now, if you've in any way compromised that system and you've reverted to more glycolytic pathways, one, there are risks with reverting to a glycolytic pathway, but at the same time, it may explain why you're struggling to get enough sufficient energy. So there are a lot of factors. Salt, is just an electrolyte that can be regulated like anything else. Salt's important for energy production as well, but it's a minor player. The key regulation is to have good functional mitochondria. So, and magnesium, because ATP is magnesium ATP. It's one thing. It requires magnesium to basically produce ATP. Now, we get enough magnesium and potassium through the diet, and we excrete less if we eat enough protein to actually have the ability for our bodies to regulate, our bodies properly, and especially the electrolytes and all that. So it really comes down to what stage are you, and have you become sort of fat adapted? So please put a comment telling me where you are at what stage, and then I've got some idea exactly what could be the specific driver. I've given you some general ideas, but play around and see whether you improve. And if you don't, drop me a message. So actually, in the beginning, I could not sleep on carnivore diet. Now I sleep like 9 to 10 hours, but I still feel fatigue. I'm 22, but I have eaten a lot of sweets and coffee and little meat. Okay, so you've basically been on a very high carbohydrate diet for a very long time. You've been on a sad diet, and you may have been consuming a lot of vegetable oils. That's the worst, actually, even worse than sugar. Vegetable oils and a lot of sugary stuff and stuff like that. And you've probably added a lot of deuterium into your system. You may have, because you're new, you probably haven't heard about deuterium. It is it's two stable isotopes of hydrogen. Basically, one is standard hydrogen, so one proton and an electron. Then you've got that's light, considered also called light water. Then you've got heavy water, which is basically a proton with a neutron stuck to it, and with an electron, and that is called heavy water or deuterium. So it's the deuterium isotope of hydrogen. That has a thing called a neutron to it. So when the neutrons build up to a certain level and get into this area where you get a concentration of protons in this inner mitochondrial membrane, which is, if you've ever seen a mitochondria, it's got all these folds. The matrix is right in the middle where the TCA cycle is. If you've never heard of the Krebs cycle, ever heard that? That's in the middle there. And then from there, it actually connects right through to these little folds, and around on either side of the folds, there is actually part of the electron chain, and the proton build up a gradient in that outer layer, and then they actually pop. See, along the electron chain, there are these pumps that pump the protons to the other side, and then they actually move into these pockets and actually create a gradient and a pressure gradient, and that will then go through that at the final end. There's this ATP synthase, these little nano machines that rotate very rapidly at 9,000 RPM. They produce the majority of ATP energy in our system. So adenosine triphosphate, as it's called, and it's really actually magnesium adenosine triphosphate, because you go from ADP to ATP, adenosine diphosphate. You have to actually add a phosphate group, and that adding basically creates that spark of the energy, which is what basically is the energy of life in our bodies. And we basically produce as much energy as our total to run out as much as our weight. So if we're 70 kilos in weight, we produce 70 kilos of ATP energy. Massive amount, our bodies. Now, that can actually drop and reduce over time, especially if you've actually damaged those mitochondria. That means you've put more of these higher isotopes in there of heavy water, and the body in the Krebs cycle, this sort of area in the matrix in the mitochondria, that strips out all these things. That there are enzymes that strip it out and actually add back in the hydrogen ions, which don't have any neutrons, because the neutrons are the ones that are actually damaging, breaking these machines. If they come through, they slow down the machinery. if there are too many that come through, they'll break the machinery. They'll jam in there and break the teeth of this rotating ATP synthase, and that will basically stuff it up, and then it's broken. Now, the body can heal this, but if you break too many, the body won't be able to, has only so much energy can produce to basically maintain the body, let alone to try and repair. It's a sort of the body's in a struggle of between, everyday energy requirements and repair. And in the ultimately, and repairing and damage. And so you gotta sort of work out, well, we need a bit of energy for this, a bit of energy for that, a bit of if you don't have enough, and you're very young, which is quite concerning to say the least. But a lot of young people now are getting pre-diabetic, diabetic, and having all sorts of problems. You can still reverse a lot of this sort of stuff. I would say I'm hoping that it's just early stages of fat adaptation, that you haven't fully fat adapted because you're at the beginning stages, and it's more that sort of stuff. And I would also add a couple of grams of taurine. I'd actually get supplemental taurine, and add some of that to basically heal some of that that tissue in your system. And I'll actually, the type that I always get, it's the only type that I'll actually recommend to people. It's a free form. It comes in a free form, unbound, and doesn't have any of the bloody issues that some of the other stuff out there in the marketplace have. So anyway, that's it there. And if you want water, this is lowering deuterium, spring alpine water. If you should hydrate with your own fat. You shouldn't be using basically water. I just use water for my coffee. I'm having milk at the moment, so raw milk. But that's a different issue altogether. But I would say that you're probably in those early, either a fat adaptation issue, and you can actually work out whether you're fat adapted or whether you are able to fat adapt with doing a bit of a fast to shift yourself into fat oxidation. And I would also say I would stay clear. I'd reduce my exposure to blue light in the evening, whether with glasses or avoiding blue screens in the evening, so you can actually increase your melatonin. I would also take those 2 grams of taurine in the evening. The reason for that is because it brings down cortisol levels and normalizes them, and it will magnify the actual effect of the actual melatonin. And you need more melatonin in your system to repair any damaged mitochondria. So yes, tap water has got as much deuterium as actual sugar, 155 parts per million. You don't see tribal people guzzling down water all the time. That's a myth. It's stupid, and it's ridiculous. Sort of the nonsense that people talk about. A bit of water is one thing. A lot of water is a bad thing. You should be hydrating with fat from your own body or from the fat you eat. That's what you should. But if you keep insulin down, you'll be able to access that fat. You'll be able to access that water, because basically the Krebs cycle is a water production cycle. It produces metabolic water. It hydrates the body. That's what the camels use. They use basically the hump. That's a whole lot of fat, which they convert to water. We can do the same thing as long as we can keep insulin down low on a low carb diet. As long as insulin is not preventing the release of fatty acids, then as long as hormone sensitive lipase is good enough, it'll actually release all those fatty acids. They'll get oxidized. They'll produce metabolic water. That is what we need, is good metabolic water. You'll work it out yourself, whether you're fat adapted or not, or whether it's just a fat adaptation issue, or because you're at the early stages, or whether it basically is a potential you've done some mitochondrial damage, and you may have lower detoxification pathways, which may mean you're one of those people that are more vulnerable. It's a smaller percentage of the population, but it is people that do have that vulnerability tend to have more problems with their mitochondria at younger age. I don't know your situation. I'm just guessing in that regard. So you need to play around and work out exactly where you're at. Don't worry yourself too much because that's not good for your health either. Just focus on the good thing about taurine, it will calm you down as well. Has a calming effect. It increases GABA and reduces anxiety, which is important. Now you're young, so you've got plenty of time to correct a lot of these things. So consider yourself lucky that you came across the carnivore community and people that know their shit rather than people that just basically talk nonsense, which is quite a few people, unfortunately.